I thought they were taking me out for a surprise birthday dinner, but halfway down the coastal road, I realized the destination wasn't a restaurant, it was Seaview Care Home. I've always said there's a particular kind of light that comes through my curtains in the morning when the sea is calm. It's softer, almost shy, as though the sun has tiptoed in so as not to wake me too abruptly. That was the light that greeted me on my 78th birthday. The gulls outside were unusually polite, calling in the distance instead of squabbling. Right above my roof, I stretched in bed and felt that familiar ache in my knees, my body's way of reminding me it's been around for quite a while. Then the phone rang. It wasn't the usual quiet, civilized ring of my landline. It was my mobile, which only a handful of people ever bother with. I fumbled for my glasses, squinting at the bright little screen. Emily, my daughter. She's not one for early calls unless something's urgent or exciting. "Morning, Dad," she chirped before I'd even managed my first hello. Her voice was bubbling with a sort of cheerfulness I hadn't heard in a long time. "Happy birthday. How's the birthday boy?" Now, no man of 78 particularly likes being called boy, but when it's your daughter, you let it slide. I chuckled. "Well, I've seen better knees, but otherwise I'm still alive, so I suppose that's cause for celebration." She laughed, but I could hear her breath coming quickly, as if she'd been moving about. "Listen, I've got a big surprise for you today. No arguments. I'll be at yours by 9:30, so have your shoes on." A surprise. I raised an eyebrow, though she couldn't see it. "What sort of surprise?" "If I told you it wouldn't be a surprise. Just trust me, Dad. You'll love it." And before I could press for details, she hung up. I sat there for a moment, phone still in my hand, listening to the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Emily's tone had been different. Warm, yes, but with that edge she gets when she's keeping something under wraps. Still, I decided not to overthink it. I had time for my morning ritual. I shuffled into the kitchen and filled the kettle, the old one with a handle that's a bit too hot to touch if you don't hold it just right. The first tea of the day is the most important, Yorkshire Gold, strong enough to stand a spoon in. As it brewed, I looked out at the small square of garden I keep. Even though the council insists on calling it a shared green space, a robin was hopping along the low fence, cocking its head as if it were judging the state of my rosebush. I thought about how birthdays have changed over the years. When Margaret was alive, there'd be cards on the table, a cake cooling on the counter, and a few friends dropping by. Since she passed 8 years ago, it's been quieter. Emily and her brother, Michael, usually call or visit. Sometimes there's a lunch out, sometimes just a slice of something from the bakery down the road. I've learned to be content with small celebrations. By the time I'd finished my toast and marmalade, the light had shifted, brighter now, filling the room. I put on my brown wool jumper, the one Emily says makes me look distinguished, and polished my shoes. A surprise outing, she'd said. I tried to guess, perhaps a trip to the theatre in London. We'd done that once for my 75th, or maybe she'd booked a table at that little seafood place in Shoreham we both like. At 9:30 sharp, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. I peered through the lace curtain and saw Emily getting out of her navy blue Honda. She was dressed smartly in a pale blue blouse and a navy jacket, hair pinned up neatly. She had that purposeful stride she's had since she was a teenager, the kind that means she's made up her mind about something. I opened the door before she could knock. "You look like you're off to a board meeting," I teased. She grinned. While I had to make an effort for the birthday boy, she stepped in and immediately gave me a hug, a long one, warmer than usual. There it was again, that extra dose of something in her manner. Excitement, yes, but also, maybe nerves. "Come on," she said, glancing at her watch. "We've got a bit of a drive ahead." I raised an eyebrow. "A drive? Where to?" "You'll see," she replied, that same playful tone she'd had on the phone. She picked up my coat from the hook and handed it to me, already halfway to the door. We stepped outside into a crisp spring morning. The air smelled faintly of salt from the sea, which was only a 10-minute walk away. The neighbor's cherry tree was in bloom, scattering pale pink petals across the pavement like confetti. As we settled into the car, she started the engine, and some cheerful music began to play. One of those playlists she makes for long journeys, the kind with Elton John, Fleetwood Mac, a bit of the Beatles thrown in for good measure. "So," I said, fastening my seatbelt, "is Michael meeting us there? Is it a family thing?" She hesitated for just a second, so brief most people wouldn't have noticed, then said, "Not exactly, but you'll see soon enough." I sipped the travel mug of tea she'd brought me, feeling the warmth spread through my hands. The streets of Brighton rolled past the row of pastel-colored houses on Marine Parade, the familiar buskers setting up near the pier. Everything felt so normal, and yet I couldn't shake the slight curiosity her secrecy stirred in me. Emily chatted about work, about a new colleague who'd joined her marketing team, about a book she'd started reading. I answered in turn, but part of my mind was trying to piece together the clues. The way she was dressed, the early start, the bit of a drive. I've always trusted Emily. She's the sort of daughter who remembers which biscuits I like with my tea and who sends me postcards from every holiday she takes. If she said she had a surprise, I believed she thought it was a good one. Still, there was that quiet little voice in the back of my head, the one you get when you're older and you've learned that not every surprise is a pleasant one. I told myself not to be daft. This was my birthday. The day had started with laughter, and I intended to keep it that way. As we left the city behind and headed along the coast road, the morning sun glinted off the water. Seagulls wheeled overhead, and the rhythmic hush of the tide followed us like a familiar song. I leaned back in my seat, watching the shoreline slide by, and decided whatever the surprise was, I'd face it with a smile. After all, how many 70-year-olds still get whisked away on secret adventures by their daughters? I had no idea then just how far from a celebration this particular adventure would take me. But in that moment, with the sunlight warm on my face and my daughter beside me, it felt like the best birthday morning I'd had in years. We took the coast road heading east, the kind that gives you those postcard views whether you want them or not. The sun was still low enough to paint the sea in long silver streaks, and the water looked calm, as if it too had decided to give me a break on my birthday. Emily kept her eyes on the road, but I noticed she was driving slower than usual. Emily normally has the patience of a seagull at a chip shop, none at all, so it struck me as odd. She was taking her time, as though the journey itself was part of whatever surprise she'd planned. We passed the Brighton Marina, where Margaret and I used to take Sunday walks. The smell of fish and chips from the little takeaway huts would drift into the breeze, and she'd pretend she didn't want any, until I bought a portion just in case. I almost mentioned it to Emily, but I bit my tongue. Some memories are like seashells, beautiful, but too fragile to pass around. Too often, a few miles later, she turned inland, taking a road that curved past Preston Park. I smiled. "You know, I first met your mother right there," I said, nodding towards the row of old elm trees. I was 22, she was 20, and she was holding a sketchbook. Emily glanced at me briefly. "You've told me that story before, but I never get tired of it. Go on." I leaned back, letting the memory unspeakable. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was supposed to be meeting a friend for a kickabout, but he never showed. I saw her sitting on that bench, drawing the trees. I asked if she minded if I sat down. She said yes, she did mind, and then she moved her bag to make room. "That was Margaret for you." She liked to be contrary, just for the sport of it. Emily laughed softly. "Sounds familiar." We carried on, and soon we were in Patcham, passing the little bakery where Margaret used to buy Chelsea buns every Friday. The window was just as I remembered, a bit steamed up, with trays of pastries lined like soldiers. For a moment, I could almost smell the warm sugar and cinnamon. The road narrowed, and the houses gave way to open fields dotted with sheep. I recognized the curve of the downs in the distance. "Feels like we're heading toward Lewes," I said, testing her reaction. She only smiled, eyes fixed ahead. "Just enjoy the ride." Dad and I did, at least for a while. We reached a lay-by overlooking the valley, and she slowed the car, letting me take in the view. Below us, the patchwork of green fields was divided by hedgerows, and the river Ouse caught the sunlight like a ribbon of glass. "We used to come here for picnics," I said. "Remember that time Michael dropped the Scotch egg down the hill, and the dog got to it before he did?" Emily grinned. "How could I forget?" He sulked for the rest of the day. It was nice. This gentle string of memories, each one like a bead sliding onto a thread. I began to think the whole outing was simply her way of walking or driving me through my life again, a kind of rolling photo album. And I have to admit, I liked that idea a little further along. She took the turning toward New Haven. We passed the harbour, where the ferries sat like patient giants waiting for their next crossing. I remembered the summer of '89 when we took the boat to Dieppe. Margaret had worn a bright yellow scarf that flapped wildly in the wind, and she'd laughed the whole time, even when we both felt seasick. Emily must have read my mind. "Mum loved that trip, didn't she?" she said quietly. "She did," I replied, my voice softer now. She said the sea made her feel small in a good way. After New Haven, the road curved back toward the coast. Seaford came into view, the chalk cliffs standing proud against the sea, a bright line where the land meets the sky. Emily slowed again. "Thought you might like to see this," she said, pulling into a small car park near the promenade. We got out, and the breeze carried that unmistakable mix of salt, sand, and seaweed. I stood for a moment, letting it fill my lungs. Seaford Beach isn't like the ones you see on glossy holiday posters. It's pebbly, and the waves sound like they're breathing in gravel, but it has its own charm. "Do you remember," Emily began, "when you taught me to skim stones here?" I smiled. "You nearly took out a seagull." She laughed, then fell silent, watching the waves. I noticed her fidget with her jacket sleeve, as though she were working up to saying something. But then she just said, "We should get going if we're going to be there on time." "Be where on time?" I asked. "You'll see." And there it was again, that playful evasion. Back in the car, we passed through a small stretch of countryside, the sort that looks unchanged for 100 years. I found myself thinking how nice it was to see these places again. Retirement has a way of shrinking your world without you noticing. You stick to the same shops, the same walks, the same armchair by the window. But here I was, being reminded that the world outside, my flat, still existed, still rolled along without me. Emily put on some music, the Beatles this time, In My Life. I nearly told her it was one of the songs we'd had at the wedding reception, but something stopped me. Maybe I didn't want to hand over every memory at once. Some things, even between father and daughter, are worth keeping tucked away. We reached Eastdean, and I recognized the little pub on the green, the Tiger Inn. "Ah, your mum loved this place," I said. "She'd always order the ploughman's lunch, and I'd get the fish pie. Still does the best fish pie in Sussex, according to the reviews," Emily said, glancing at me with a half smile. "We could stop if you want." I shook my head. "Let's keep going. I'm curious now," and I was. More than curious. There was a strange rhythm to this trip, the deliberate passing of familiar landmarks, the way she let me reminisce without rushing me, the careful avoidance of telling me where we were going. Part of me was enjoying the nostalgia, yes, but another part, the part that knows his daughter's tells, began to suspect that this wasn't just a scenic drive for pleasure's sake. Still, as we drove through the Seven Sisters Country Park, I let myself be distracted by the rolling green hills, the grazing sheep, the sharp white line of the cliffs in the distance. The wind buffeted the car slightly, and sunlight flashed between the hedgerows like a flickering film reel. I thought of Margaret again, not the young woman sketching in the park, but the older Margaret, in her 50s, hair streaked with silver, sitting beside me on a day just like this. She'd point out shapes in the clouds and tease me about my dad driving. Funny, isn't it, how the older you get, the more your memories come with weather attached. By the time we reached the outskirts of Eastbourne, I'd stopped trying to guess. Emily had been too careful. I decided to let the day unfold as she wanted. Besides, the morning had been a gift in itself, a journey through the landscape of my own life, each stop a gentle reminder of where I'd been and who I'd loved. And if the destination matched the warmth of the road there, I thought, then perhaps this really would be one of the best birthdays in years. Of course, I didn't yet know how wrong I was. As we entered Eastbourne, I noticed Emily took the long way round, avoiding the main seafront road, where the hotels and ice cream stalls line up like contestants in a beauty pageant. Instead, she steered us through quieter residential streets, the kind with neat front gardens and freshly painted fences. "Shortcut?" I asked. She kept her eyes on the road. "Sort of. Less traffic this way." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced. Emily's always been one for efficiency. If there's a quicker way, she takes it, and if there isn't, she'll find one. This detour, however, didn't seem to be shaving off any time. We passed a row of small shops, a greengrocer, a charity shop, and one of those little cafes with lace curtains in the window. I caught the smell of fresh coffee, and for a second thought about suggesting we stop, but something in her body language stopped me. She was gripping the wheel just a touch too tightly, shoulders a bit too square. It wasn't just her posture, It was the way she kept glancing at her phone in the holder on the dashboard, as if waiting for a message or checking a map. She'd never been shy about telling me where we were going before. "You all right?" I asked casually. "Of course," she said quickly, almost too quickly. "Just making sure we're on schedule." "Schedule for what?" She smiled, or rather, she put on the shape of a smile without the warmth behind it. "Patience, Dad. You'll find out soon enough." I leaned back, watching the houses give way to stretches of open green. The hedgerows here were thick and well kept, the kind that made you feel you were driving through a series of living tunnels. Every now and then the sunlight broke through in patches, flashing across the bonnet, and then I saw it. A road sign. White background, green lettering. It read, "Seaview Residential Care, 2 miles." I didn't say anything at first. Maybe it was a coincidence. After all, small towns are full of places like that, and plenty of roads lead past them. But I did notice that Emily's eyes flicked toward the sign just long enough for me to know she'd seen it too. "Seaview," I said aloud, keeping my tone neutral. "That's a care home, isn't it?" She shifted in her seat. "I think so. Yes, I've heard of it. Funny name," I continued, considering it's set back from the coast. She murmured, her attention fixed firmly on the road. "The thing about being a father is, you learn to hear what your children don't say. You can catch it in the tiny pauses, the clipped answers, the way they suddenly decide a question isn't worth answering at all." We drove on in silence for a while, the only sound, the low hum of the engine and the occasional whoosh of another car passing in the opposite direction. I found myself watching the road signs more carefully now, almost as if I were gathering evidence. Another appeared, "Seaview Residential Care, next right." Emily kept straight on. All this mystery for a birthday lunch. I tried to make it sound like a joke, but the words tasted different, leaving my mouth heavier somehow. She didn't bite. "You'll see." We passed the turning and carried on. That should have reassured me, but instead, I felt the unease deepen. She could have taken that turn and ended this little guessing game, but she didn't. It was as if she was circling something, literally and figuratively. We climbed a gentle hill, and from the top, I caught a glimpse of the sea again, glinting. In the distance, normally that would lift my spirits, but my mind was elsewhere now, turning over possibilities like a dog worrying at a bone. Perhaps she was taking me to visit an old friend who'd moved in to save you. That would make sense, a surprise reunion. But she'd have told me, wouldn't she? And why dress so formally for a friendly visit? I was still mulling it over. When we hit a small roundabout, Emily took the second exit, which, according to the sign, led back toward the coast, and toward Seaview again. That's when my stomach gave a small twist. "Emily," I said, keeping my voice steady, "we've been going in circles." She glanced at me quickly, then back at the road. "It's just the way the sat-nav's taking us." "Don't worry." The sat-nav, I noticed, had its volume turned down. We passed a row of bungalows, each with a neatly trimmed lawn and a row of ceramic garden gnomes or wind chimes. An elderly man in a flat cap was sitting on a bench, feeding pigeons. For a moment, I imagined myself there in 10 years, doing exactly the same. The thought should have been comforting. It wasn't. The air in the car felt heavier somehow, the kind of weight you get before a summer storm. I looked at Emily's hands on the wheel again. She wasn't just gripping it, her knuckles were pale. "Is everything all right at work?" I asked suddenly, just to see if she'd be thrown off. "Fine," she said, without hesitation, but her voice was tight. I tried another tack. "Is this surprise something to do with Michael?" "No." The single syllable landed, like a closed door. We passed yet another sign, "Seaview Residential Care, Visitors Welcome." I don't know why that one stuck with me. Maybe it was the visitors welcome part. It felt like a message aimed right at me, as if the sign itself knew where I was headed, and wanted to soften the blow. We were definitely closer now. I could see a cluster of larger buildings in the distance, pale against the green of the fields. I wasn't certain, but I thought I spotted a flagpole and a neatly kept garden in front, the sort of thing care homes and hospitals both seemed to favor. Emily slowed slightly, scanning the side roads. "Emily," I said again, this time more firmly. "Where exactly are we going?" She took a breath, her fingers tightening further on the steering wheel. "Dad, just wait a few more minutes, all right? I promise it'll make sense when we get there." Her voice had softened, almost pleading. I didn't push it further. There are moments when you realize you won't get an answer, no matter how many times you ask. Instead, I turned my gaze back to the passing scenery, the hedgerows, the occasional glimpse of the sea, the shifting clouds overhead, but I wasn't really seeing them anymore. My mind was busy fitting pieces together, and the picture they were forming was one I wasn't sure I wanted to look at. The odd signs weren't just on the roadside anymore. They were in the way she avoided my eyes, the way her smile came and went too quickly, the way the conversation kept circling safe topics only to fall silent again. And deep down, though I didn't want to admit it, even to myself, I had a sinking feeling I already knew where this road was leading. We came round a bend, and suddenly the road widened. On the left, a high hedge broke, revealing a long driveway lined with tidy flower beds and a sign in dark blue with gold lettering. Even before I could read it, I felt my chest tighten, the kind of tension that starts in your ribs and climbs into your throat. Seaview Residential Care. The words seemed to sit there in front of me, impossibly large, even though the sign was just a couple of meters wide. The gold letters gleamed in the sunlight, neat and professional, like they were trying to make a promise they couldn't possibly keep. Emily slowed the car and turned in without saying a word. Gravel crunched under the tires, and the building came into view. 3 stories, pale cream walls, white-framed windows, and a roof of neat grey tiles. A row of geraniums in bright red planters lined the entrance. It was immaculate, the sort of place you might put on a brochure to reassure people. It didn't reassure me. I glanced at Emily, but she kept her eyes forward, lips pressed together. "Emily," I said, my voice quieter now. "What is this?" She exhaled slowly, as if bracing herself. "It's somewhere I thought you might like to see, just to look around. No pressure. Somewhere to look around," I repeated, the words tasting sour in my mouth. "On my birthday." She pulled into a parking space near the front. A man in a pale blue shirt, probably staff, was sweeping petals off the path. He gave us a polite nod, the sort you give visitors, not residents. "Dad, please," she said, turning off the engine. "Just hear me out before you get upset." "I'm not upset," I said, though I could feel the heat rising under my collar. "I'm just wondering why we're here at all." She turned toward me, her eyes softer now. "You've been living alone for 8 years. You've had 2 falls this year. You've told me yourself the nights feel long. I thought maybe it was time to think about somewhere you'd be safe, with people around. Somewhere nice." She gestured toward the building, as if the flower beds could make her case for her. I stared at her for a long moment. The words were all there, safe people around, somewhere nice, but underneath them was something else entirely. "I told your mother," I said slowly, "and I told you. After she passed, I never wanted to be put away. Not like this." Her jaw tightened. "It's not being put away, Dad. It's moving forward, moving forward." The phrase clanged in my head like a dropped spanner. We sat in silence for a moment. Through the windscreen, I could see the glass doors at the entrance slide open, and an elderly woman with a walking frame shuffled out, accompanied by a young woman in a nurse's uniform. The nurse was smiling, saying something that made the older woman laugh. It should have been a comforting image. It wasn't. Emily reached for her bag. "Come on, just 10 minutes. If you hate it, we'll leave." I didn't move. "You think you can make a decision like this in 10 minutes? I'm not asking you to decide today," she said, her voice almost pleading now. "I'm just asking you to keep an open mind. Please, for me, for me." Those 2 words are dangerous. They're the ones that turn arguments into obligations, the ones that make you swallow what you were about to say because love is tangled up in them. I opened my door slowly, more to buy time than because I'd decided anything. The spring air hit my face, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and the faint tang of disinfectant. The gravel path crunched under our feet as we walked toward the entrance. Up close, the building felt even more deliberate. The spotless paint, the carefully arranged planters, the faint hum of automatic doors sliding open before us. Inside, the air was warm and faintly perfumed, like someone had tried to mask the more clinical smells with lavender. A woman at the reception desk looked up and smiled brightly. "Good morning. You must be Mr. Bennett, and this is your daughter, Emily." I shot Emily a look. They were expecting us. Emily gave a tiny shrug, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "I booked a tour." The receptionist stood, her smile unwavering. "Welcome to Seaview. We're so glad you could come in today. Let me just fetch Mary, our care coordinator. She'll show you around." While she disappeared into a back office, I looked around. The reception area was spotless. Pale wood floors, A few comfortable-looking chairs, a coffee table with neatly arranged magazines. A large notice board displayed photos of residents at what appeared to be themed events, a Hawaiian day, with leis and paper umbrellas, a Christmas party with tinsel everywhere. Everyone in the pictures was smiling, but there was something about those smiles, as if they were for the camera, not for themselves. Emily was watching me carefully. "Dad, just walk through it, see what it's like. If it's not for you, that's fine." Mary arrived then, mid-40s, with short brown hair and a warm handshake. "Mr. Bennett, happy birthday. We'll keep this short and sweet." Short and sweet. I'd heard that before, in doctors' offices and during awkward meetings at work. It always meant just long enough to convince you. She led us down a wide corridor painted in pastel yellow. The air was warm, and soft instrumental music played from hidden speakers. As we passed open doors, I caught glimpses of tidy rooms with single beds, armchairs, and small televisions. Some had framed family photos on the dressers. We passed a lounge where 4 residents sat watching daytime television. A man in his 80s was dozing in an armchair. A woman was knitting slowly, her eyes never leaving the screen. Mary kept up a steady commentary about activities, meal options, medical support, and safety features. I barely heard her. My eyes kept drifting to the people, the way they looked at us, the way some didn't look at all. At one point, we stepped out into the garden. Neat lawns, a few benches, and a view of the distant sea. If you craned your neck, the air was fresher here, but it didn't shake the heaviness I felt. Emily was smiling politely, nodding at Mary's explanations. I couldn't tell if she believed everything being said or if she was just hoping I would. When we finally returned to reception, Mary handed me a glossy brochure. On the cover, a silver-haired man in a cardigan was laughing at something a nurse had said, his hand resting on her arm in a gesture that looked staged. I thanked her out of habit, then turned to Emily. "Well," I said, "we've seen it." Her eyes searched mine, and I said slowly, "I think I'd like to go home now." She hesitated, then nodded. Of course. We walked back to the car in silence. The gravel crunched again underfoot. The geraniums stood in their perfect rows, and the gold letters on the sign caught the sun as we passed. I didn't look back. We hadn't been back on the main road for more than a few minutes before the silence settled in like an unwelcome passenger. Emily kept her eyes on the traffic ahead, her hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel, driving with the kind of precision that tells you someone is concentrating on something other than the road. I watched the hedgerows slide past the window, green blurs under the pale April sky. The brochure from Seaview was still on my lap. I'd meant to shove it into the door pocket, but my hands hadn't moved since Mary placed it there. The smiling faces on the cover stared back at me, and I stared at them, wondering how many of them had been brought for a visit the way I had. I closed it and set it face down. Emily glanced over. "I didn't mean to upset you, Dad." I kept my eyes on the road. "You didn't upset me," I said, though the tightness in my chest told me otherwise. "You surprised me." "That was never the idea," she said quietly. "That's the problem," I replied. "You thought you knew what I'd want without asking me." The words hung in the air, heavier than either of us wanted. As we passed the familiar sign for Lose Again, a memory slid into my mind so vividly I could almost smell it, the faint lavender scent of Margaret's perfume, the steady hum of rain against the kitchen window. It had been the week after her funeral. Emily and Michael were at the table with me, each of us with a cup of tea we barely touched. The air felt thick with things we didn't know how to say. I remember Emily taking my hand across the table. "Dad," she'd said softly, "whatever happens, you'll always have us. And we'll never put you somewhere you don't want to be, right, Mike?" Michael had nodded. Of course. At the time, I'd managed a half smile, though the grief was still raw. "I appreciate that," I'd said. "I've seen what it's like in those places. Not for me." And Emily had squeezed my hand, promising, "We'll look after you." Promises. They sound solid when they're spoken, like stones you can build on. But over time, you find some of them crumble in your hand. "Do you remember," I said now, breaking the silence in the car, "what you told me after your mother died?" Emily's hands tightened on the wheel. "Dad, you said you'd never put me somewhere I didn't want to be. Those were your words." "I know what I said," she murmured, "and yet here we are." Her voice rose slightly. "I wasn't putting you there today. I just wanted you to see it, to know it's an option." "An option I never asked for," I said. The road curved toward the coast again. and for a moment the sea flashed into view, bright and cold-looking under the thin sunlight. I thought of Margaret again, how she used to love these drives, her hand resting lightly on my arm, pointing out cloud shapes or spotting birds in the distance. She'd never been one for surprises either. "Tell me where we're going," she used to say, "so I can decide if I want to come." The memory made my throat ache. We passed through a small village, the kind with a single pub and a post office that also sells milk, bread, and greeting cards. Outside the pub, a group of men my age was standing with pints in hand, laughing about something. I wondered if any of them had been taken for a look around somewhere. I wondered if they'd be laughing quite as loudly afterwards. "I'm not angry, Emily," I said finally, "though maybe I was. I just wish you'd talked to me first. We could have had this conversation at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, not in some corridor that smells of disinfectant." Her voice softened. "I didn't want to upset you at home. I thought, if you saw it for yourself, you might see it differently." "Differently from what?" "From the picture you've got in your head," she said. "The one from when you were young, the old council-run places, with peeling paint and no activities, and everyone staring at the same wall. It's not like that anymore, Dad." I thought of the lounge we'd passed, the man dozing in his chair, the woman knitting without looking at her needles. Some things haven't changed as much as you think. We fell into silence again. By the time we reached the outskirts of Brighton, the traffic had picked up. I watched the buses trundle past, full of people going about their ordinary Fridays, unaware that someone in the next lane was quietly holding a grudge against his own daughter. When we pulled up outside my building, Emily switched off the engine but didn't move to get out. She sat there, hands still on the wheel, staring at the dashboard. "Dad," she said after a moment, "I love you. Everything I do because I want you to be safe." "I know you do," I said. "And I love you too. But safety isn't the only thing worth living for." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, as if we'd reached the end of a conversation that neither of us was satisfied with. I opened the door and stepped out, the cool air hitting my face. She followed, handing me the brochure as I went to shut the door. "You might not want it now," she said, "but just keep it, please." I took it, though I didn't look at it. "All right." She hugged me before I could step away, tighter than I expected, as if trying to hold me in place for just a second longer. Then she let go, got back in the car, and drove off. I stood there for a moment, watching the taillights disappear around the corner. The wind off the sea was stronger now, and it carried the faint tang of salt and the far-off cries of gulls. Inside, I set the brochure on the kitchen counter without opening it. I made a cup of tea, the way I always do, and sat in my armchair by the window. The pier was just visible in the distance, its silhouette familiar against the fading light. I thought about promises, about how they can feel as real as the ground under your feet until someone moves them, and suddenly you're standing over empty air. And I thought about Margaret, the steady weight of her hand in mine, the sound of her voice saying, "We'll always decide together." Now, I supposed, I'd have to decide on my own. The Saturday after Emily took me to Seaview, I found myself standing by the window again, watching the buses go by. Normally, I would have gone for my morning walk to the seafront, maybe stopped by the cafe on Queen's Road for a bacon sandwich and a chat with Peter, the owner. But that morning, my feet felt rooted to the carpet. It wasn't just the trip to Seaview. Lingering in my mind, it was the silence that followed. Emily hadn't called all week. Michael hadn't either. For a family that prides itself on keeping in touch, that absence was telling. When the phone finally rang, wasn't either of them. It was Arthur, my oldest friend from the post office days. "Harold, mate," he said, in that brisk, no-nonsense way of his. "You free for a pint later?" "I might be," I said. "Depends on the weather." Arthur chuckled. "Weather's fine. You're just making excuses. Come on, the Kings. Head at 2. No arguments." And so, at 1:30, I put on my coat and set off. The walk to the pub was shorter than I remembered, though maybe that was because my mind wasn't on the route. It was on the memory of Emily's hands on the steering wheel, her voice saying, "I just wanted you to see it." The King's Head was busy, as it always is on a Saturday. Arthur had already claimed a corner table, 2 pints waiting. "You look like a man with something on his mind," he said, sliding one toward me. I took a sip before answering. "You ever feel like people are making decisions for you without asking?" Arthur smirked. "Married for 40 years. Harold, of course I do. This is different, I said. Emily took me to a care home last week, didn't tell me where we were going, made it sound like a surprise. Arthur leaned back, eyebrows raised. Blimey, how'd that go? I told him. The reception area, the two bright smiles, the faint smell of disinfectant beneath the polish. I told him about the brochure and the promises after Margaret's funeral. He listened without interrupting, just nodding every so often. When I finished, he drummed his fingers on the table. Well, he said, it's not the worst thing in the world, seeing what's out there, but I get your point. You want to be the one holding the reins. Exactly. We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the rugby on the screen above the bar. Then Arthur said, my brother-in-law's in one of those places. Went in last year. His choice. Mind. You says it's fine, but he still complains about the tea. I smiled faintly. I'd complain too. Nobody makes tea the way I like it. That got a laugh from Arthur, and for a moment the heaviness in my chest eased, but it didn't last. Even on the walk home, the weight of that visit pressed on me, like I'd stepped onto a path without realizing it, and now couldn't see where. It ended. That night, Emily called. Hi, Dad, she said, sounding cautious. Hello, Emily, how've you been? Fine. Busy. She hesitated. Look, about last week, I cut in gently. We've been over that, love. I know. I don't want you to think I was tricking you. I thought if you saw it, you might feel differently. I felt exactly how I thought I'd feel, I said. Out of place. Silence. Then, I worry about you, Dad. You're on your own. So much. What if you fall? What if something happens? I've managed so far. That's what Mum used to say, Emily murmured. Her words landed harder than she probably meant. Margaret had been fiercely independent, too right, up until the day she collapsed in the garden. I appreciate your concern, I said quietly. But concern isn't the same as deciding my life for me. I'm not deciding, you are, I said, more sharply than intended. We both fell silent. Finally, she said, all right, I'll drop it for now, but will you at least keep the brochure? I've still got it. Good, that's all I'm asking. We said our goodnights, but the tension lingered like a draft you can't quite find the source of. The days that followed blurred into one another. I kept to my routines, shopping at the Coop on Mondays, reading the paper in the afternoons, catching the odd match on television, but my mind kept circling back to see, not the building itself, but the feeling it gave me, that my life was being quietly repackaged into something smaller, easier to manage. On Thursday, Michael called. He rarely does, unless there's something specific he wants. All right, Dad, he said. Still breathing, I replied. He chuckled. Emily says you weren't too happy about the little trip. That's one way of putting it. She means well, you know. I'm aware. Michael cleared his throat. It's just, we worry. You're getting on a bit. Things happen. I'm aware of that too. Another pause. You're not angry, are you? I'm not impressed, I said. He sighed. Look, we're just trying to make sure you've got options. No one's pushing you anywhere. That's what people say right before they start pushing, I replied. Michael didn't argue. He just said, all right, Dad, take care, and hung up. That evening, I sat by the window with the brochure in my lap. I opened it for the first time since Mary handed it to me. The photos were exactly what you'd expect. Residents playing bingo, a smiling chef serving roast chicken, a group doing seated exercises in a sunny lounge. It all looked pleasant enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that every smile was practiced, every activity staged for the camera. Margaret would have seen through it in a second. They're showing you what they want you to see, she would have said, and she'd be right. I set the brochure aside and made myself another cup of tea. The kettle's whistle was the only sound in the flat. In the quiet, I thought about the drive back from Sevutha, where Emily had gripped the wheel, the way neither of us knew what to say. It struck me that silence can be more exhausting than an argument. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept replaying the visit in my mind, each detail sharper than the last. The corridor with its pale blue walls, the faint clatter of dishes from the dining hall, the way Mary's voice softened when she spoke to Emily, but not to me. By 2 a.m, I gave up on sleep entirely. I put the kettle on again and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from my mug. Outside, the street was empty, the lamplight casting long shadows on the pavement. In the stillness, I admitted something to myself I hadn't wanted to face. Part of me was afraid, not of the home itself, but of how easily one could slide from just visiting to settling in. One day you're there for lunch. The next, your things are in a cupboard, and your front door key is useless. I stayed at the table until dawn, when the first buses began rumbling past. The world carried on, indifferent to whether I stayed in my flat or not. But I cared, and I wasn't ready to give up my key. I've always been a man who values a good night's sleep. Back when I worked at the post office in Leeds, I could be in bed by 10 and up by 6 without even setting an alarm. Margaret used to say I was like a farm rooster, always waking up at the same time, rain or shine. But lately, sleep had become something slippery, something I could reach for but not quite grasp. That night, morning, technically after the conversation with Michael, I found myself staring at the ceiling at 2:17 a.m., the shadows from the street lamp outside sliding across the walls. The house felt too big in the dark. Not physically. Of course, it's just a modest two-bedroom terrace, but in the silence. The rooms seemed to stretch, the air pressing against my ears like deep water. It's a strange thing, realizing that what used to feel like a home can, in the right or wrong circumstances, start feeling like a hollow space. I tried reading, picked up the old copy of The Old Man and the Sea from the nightstand. I've read it 3 times before. The first time, I was 19. The second, I was 38 and going through a rough patch at work. The third was the year Margaret passed. Now, the words swam in front of me, my mind slipping away from Santiago and his Marlin to Emily's tight-lipped smile in the car, to Mary's rehearsed warmth at sea. I closed the book and let it rest on my chest. My mind wouldn't stop. Thoughts seemed to line up at the edge of my consciousness, each one eager to step forward, as if they'd all been waiting for me to lie awake so they could have their say. What if they're right? What if you fall in the kitchen and no one knows until it's too late? What if you wake up one day and can't remember where you are? I don't like admitting it, but those questions weren't entirely unreasonable. I've had 2 falls in the past 3 years. Nothing serious, one on the garden path, when the paving stone wobbled under my foot, another when I tripped over the vacuum cord. Both times I got up on my own, but it rattled me. And then there was the matter of memory. I've never been one for forgetting appointments, but last month I missed my dental checkup, simply didn't turn up. The receptionist called, and I had no excuse except that the date had slipped right out of my head. I sipped my tea, my 3rd cup of the night, and stared at the window, my reflection faint against the black outside. It struck me then that perhaps Emily and Michael weren't entirely wrong. Perhaps their worry wasn't just meddling, but something born out of genuine fear. Still, there's a vast difference between acknowledging someone's concern and handing them the keys to your life. Around 4 o'clock, I pulled out the box of photographs from the sideboard in the living room. I don't know why. Maybe I was looking for proof that I'd had a life worth clinging to. Something more than what could fit into a small bedroom at a care home. The photos smelled faintly of old paper and dust. There was one of Margaret and me in Scarborough, 1968. She's wearing a blue scarf, her hair catching the wind, eyes bright despite the cold. I remember that day, how we'd saved up for months to take the train up the coast, how we'd eaten fish and chips from newspaper and laughed when the seagulls tried to steal them. There were photos of the children, to Millie at 5, grinning, with her 2 front teeth missing, Michael in his school football kit, grass stains on his socks, birthdays, Christmases, family picnics in Roundhay Park. As I sifted through them, I noticed something. In nearly every picture, I'm not looking at the camera, I'm looking at someone: Margaret, the kids, a friend. My life, it seemed, had always been oriented towards others, providing, listening, making sure everyone else had what they needed. Now, with those people grown or gone, I wondered, was that why the flat felt so empty? Because I'd built a life around being useful, and now there was no one left who needed me in the same way. By 5:30, the first blush of dawn was creeping into the sky. I decided there was no point in going back to bed. Instead, I pulled on my coat and stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying that faint tang of salt from the North Sea. Leeds isn't exactly a seaside town, but on certain mornings when the wind comes from the east, you catch just a whisper of it. The streets were nearly empty, save for the odd milk delivery van. My footsteps echoed on the pavement as I made my way toward the park. The grass was damp with dew, and a pair of magpies hopped about near the benches, their heads jerking as they searched for crumbs. I sat down and watched the sky lighten, the magpies eventually flying off, and there, in the stillness, I thought about the way forward. I didn't want to spend my final years in a place like Sevenot yet, but I also didn't want my children to lie awake at night wondering if I'd be all right. There had to be a middle ground. Maybe I could make some changes. Move my bedroom downstairs to avoid the stairs at night. Keep my mobile phone in my pocket instead of leaving it on the kitchen counter. Let Arthur check in on me twice a week. It wasn't surrender, it was adaptation. When I got home, I found the brochure still on the kitchen table where I'd left it. I picked it up again. This time, I didn't feel the sharp spike of resentment I'd felt before. I still didn't want what it offered, but I could at least see why Emily thought it might be a kindness. I slid it into the drawer under the phone. Not in the bin, not on display, just somewhere out of sight, where it could rest until it was truly needed. Margaret used to say, we make our choices, and then our choices make us. I wasn't ready to hand mine over just yet, but maybe I could choose to meet my children halfway, before the silence between us became as permanent as the tide. That night, when I finally lay down, sleep came more easily. Not because the problem had been solved, but because I'd stopped running from it. The truth is, life isn't a battle you win, it's a tide you learn to navigate. And as I drifted off, I thought of the sea at Scarborough, the waves rolling in steady and sure, just as they always had. The morning after my sleepless wanderings, I woke with a sense of resolve that felt strange, almost foreign. It wasn't the kind of stubbornness I'd been carrying these past few weeks, the kind that made me slam drawers and mutter under my breath about ungrateful children. No, this was quieter, steadier, the kind of resolve you feel when you know you've reached a turning point, whether you asked for it or not. I brewed a pot of tea, made a proper breakfast, bacon, eggs, fried bread, and sat at the table with my notepad, the one with the faded Leeds United crest on the cover. I wasn't planning to write a letter, but I needed to arrange my thoughts. If I was going to talk to Emily and Michael, I didn't want my words to come out tangled with anger. I started with the simple truth. I'm not ready to leave my home. Then, underneath, I added the part I'd never said aloud. But I understand why you're worried. It looked odd, those two sentences sitting side by side, like two neighbors who'd never spoken but suddenly found themselves sharing a garden fence. By the time I'd finished my tea, I knew what I needed to do. I picked up the phone and rang Emily. She answered on the second ring, her voice brisk, as though she was already in the middle of something. Dad, everything all right? Yes, love, I said, keeping my tone even. I was wondering if you and Michael could come by this evening. There's something I'd like to talk about. There was a pause on her end, long enough for me to picture her glancing at the clock, calculating how to fit me into whatever color-coded schedule she keeps in that head of hers. Of course, she said. I'll check with Michael and let you know what time. They arrived together at 6:30. Emily wore her usual business casual navy trousers, cream blouse, while Michael looked like he'd come straight from the building site, dust still on his boots. They sat at the kitchen table, side by side, both of them looking slightly apprehensive, as though they'd been summoned for a school report. I didn't waste time. I know you're concerned. About me, I began, looking from one to the other. And I know this isn't coming from a place of malice. You're worried about my safety, about me being alone. Emily shifted in her seat, but said nothing. Michael nodded once. But, I continued, this is my home. I've lived here for over 40 years. Every brick, every creak in the floorboards, I know them like the lines on my hands. I'm not ready to leave it behind, not for a care home, not yet. Michael started to speak, but I held up a hand. Let me finish. They both waited. I'm not blind to the fact that I'm getting older. I've had a couple of falls. My memory isn't what it once was. I understand that these things worry you, and I admit there are moments when they worry me too. I saw Emily's eyebrows rise slightly at that. She wasn't expecting me to concede anything. That's why, I went on, I'm willing to make some changes. I'll move my bedroom downstairs so I'm not climbing stairs at night. I'll keep my phone in my pocket at all times, and I'll let Arthur check in on me twice a week. If you like, we can arrange for one of those emergency alert pendants. Michael leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Emily's gaze softened a little, but there was still tension in her shoulders. But, I said again, this is not a negotiation about moving me into C. That will happen when I decide it's time, when I feel I can't manage here, not when someone else decides for me. Do we understand each other? The silence stretched for a moment. I could almost hear the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, Emily spoke. Dad, I didn't realize you'd been thinking about it like this. She stopped, exhaled. I just don't want to get a phone call one day saying something's happened to you and we didn't do enough to prevent it. I know, love, I said gently, and I appreciate that. But part of getting older is accepting risk. You can wrap me in bubble wrap, but then I'm not living, I'm just stored. Michael uncrossed his arms and scratched the back of his neck. I'll be honest, Dad, I still think Sevier would be the safest place. But if you're willing to take those precautions, I can live with that. For now, I smiled faintly. For now is all any of us have, son. We spent the next half hour talking through practicalities. Michael offered to help move the bed downstairs next weekend. Emily said she'd researched the best alert pendant systems. I agreed to send them both a text every morning. Just a quick good morning so they'd know I was all right. It wasn't perfect, there was still unease in their eyes, but it was a truce. Before they left, Emily gave me a hug. Not one of those polite, quick hugs she sometimes gives at Christmas, but a proper one. Michael shook my hand, his grip firm. Just promise me one thing, he said. What's that? That when you feel you can't manage anymore, you'll tell us, before it gets bad. I looked at him for a moment, then nodded. I promise. After they left, I stood in the doorway for a long while, watching their car disappear down the street. The house felt quieter than ever. But the quiet was different now. Less like an empty shell, more like a place that had been defended, claimed. I went into the living room and picked up the box of photographs again. This time, I didn't feel the sharp tug of loss. Instead, I felt something closer to gratitude. These were the people and moments that had shaped my life. And for however long I could, I intended to keep living among them. I put the box away, made myself another cup of tea, and sat in my armchair by the window. The street lamp outside flickered on, casting its familiar golden glow. It occurred to me then that maybe this whole episode wasn't just about my children worrying about MIT, was about them learning to see me as I am now, not just as the father who could carry them on his shoulders or fix anything with a few tools in the shed, and perhaps it was about me learning to see them differently too, not just as the children I once guided, but as adults trying, in their own imperfect ways, to guide me. We were all adjusting to new roles. None of us particularly liked it, but that's life, isn't it? You grow into your shoes, and just when they fit perfectly, you find you've been given a new pair. That night, before I went to bed, I took the Seaview brochure out of the drawer. I didn't throw it away. I didn't put it back, either. I left it on the sideboard, in plain sight, not as a threat, not as a surrender, just as a reminder that time moves on, tides change, and one day, I might decide the tides come in far enough, but that day wasn't today. And until it comes, I'll wake each morning in my own bed, make my own tea, and watch the magpies in the park. Because this is my life, and for now, I'm still the one